Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Teena Jha, you're watching Perspective. Amid an unprecedented and complex geopolitical situation, India is now recognized as a voice that speaks for all and stands for peace, security and prosperity. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said this in Parliament on Thursday. Making a suo motu statement on the latest developments in India's foreign policy in both houses of Parliament, Dr. Jaishankar highlighted the rising stature of India on the international level, listing out the overseas engagements by the President, the Vice President, the Prime Minister and also other Union Ministers. He also said India's G20 presidency has served as a catalyst in invigorating the country's foreign policy and also realizing the vision of an Atmanirbhar and Viksit Bharat. Highlighting the key foreign policy engagements and initiatives taken by India since the budget session, which ended on the 6th of April, Dr. Jaishankar said Prime Minister Narendra Modi's official state visit to the United States from 20th to 23rd of June was only the second by an Indian Prime Minister. He was also accorded the rare privilege of addressing the joint session of the US Congress for a second time. The minister's speech, however, was disrupted by constant sloganeering from opposition parties. In Perspective today, we will analyze the key takeaways from the External Affairs Minister's statement in Parliament, also the achievements in Indian foreign policy in recent months. And for this, I'm joined by two distinguished panelists. So let me begin by introducing them to you. I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation. Dr. Gupta was the Deputy National Security Advisor and Secretary, National Security Council, Government of India during 2014 to 2017. And also delighted to have with us Professor Harshvi Pant, Vice President, Studies in Foreign Policy, Observer Research Foundation. He's a Professor of International Relations with King's India Institute at King's College, London. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective. Dr. Gupta, let me come to you first. What has been the biggest highlight for you from this statement made by the External Affairs Minister on the recent achievements of India's foreign policy?
Well, it was a very comprehensive statement which the External Affairs Minister made. So there were obviously many points in that statement. But for me, I think I will pick up 2 or 3 points which struck me as something which defines the framework of our foreign policy. One is that it is a people-centric foreign policy. And I think that has been the hallmark of Modi foreign policy for the last several years. The foreign policy has also become like the Jan Bhagedari, the way we are describing our G20 business. The issues that are in the forefront are which concern the people almost immediately. And I think when he talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat and Viksit Bharat, this is something that will impact each one of us. So that's, I think, one point that I found very impressive. The second point was his description of the world. He described it as volatile and uncertain and complex. Now, some years ago, there was this famous abbreviation called VUCA. How was the word described? As VUCA. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think this is the right description of the word, and this also means that there would be many challenges that the Indian foreign policy and the policy makers would be facing in the coming years, and we have to be ready to deal with an uncertain world. So these two are very important takeaways for me.
Okay, Professor Pant, your perspective on how the External Affairs Minister actually describes the current geopolitical scenario as a complex one. Dr. Gupta puts it as a volatile, ambiguous scenario that prevails today. And in this scenario, India is being recognized as the voice of peace, as the voice of security, as the voice of prosperity. What really has strengthened India's foreign policy in the last few years, which has changed the world's view about India?
Well, thank you, Teena. And I think this perception of India as a country that is on the move, a country that is now not simply, is part of a large global order where it is taking the norms and institutions and platforms that are given to it. But here is a country now that I think, in the words of the foreign minister, that wants to not only aspire to be a leading power, but is playing a leading role today as a new order is being constructed. And I think that has been perhaps one of the most important change in the way India is being perceived today, that it is not a passive recipient in the global order. It is now actively contributing to that order in multiple ways, whether it is redefining the norms of conduct, whether it is creating new platforms, creating new initiatives, and by the sheer dint of its very, very effective and I would say very buoyant diplomacy, from Prime Minister, Foreign Minister onwards. If you see, there is a whole of government approach to foreign policy and national security today that we had not had in the past. So when you have that kind of a whole of government approach, you see its impact, whether you are engaging in trade negotiations, strategic negotiations, negotiations for supply chain restructuring, whether you are negotiating about critical supply minerals, critical technologies. I think that perception that India is no longer diffident about articulating its views, about articulating what its interests are, and about engaging multiple stakeholders. So when you see today that perhaps Indian Prime Minister is the only world leader who can call up whether it is Russian president or American president or Ukrainian president or European Union leaders or African leaders, that's a great sign of strength that India as a country is today respected and accepted as a country where the nations and the leaders are willing to engage with that on equal terms. And I think that's a sign of a confident power, confident country coming into its own, but also defining its own interests in the larger interests of the global community, that we are not in it for ourselves, we are also contributing to the global order. Unlike some other countries that are more disruptive, India is a country that is building a global order that perhaps also helps other nations. So, for example, when we talk of G20 presidency, this idea of global South, the summit that we called, before the G20 presidency took momentum, where we invited all of the developing countries and we asked them, look, what do you want? How do you want us to represent you in the global South? What is your agenda? Can we put those issues on the table? I think that's a sign of a very confident country that is willing to engage with the world on its own terms, but on terms that are also beneficial for the world at large. And there, I think this perception of India as a country that is growing. Of course, we are doing well economically, but we are also now engaged. We are doing something with that power. The purpose behind India's power is perhaps better articulated today and therefore better respected today than in the past.
Taking on the point from G20, Dr. Gupta, to you, G20 agenda, when India set the agenda for itself, it highlighted on some words like inclusive, ambitious, action-oriented, also decisive. And that is wherein we took several initiatives which had not been taken in the past. For example, the Voice of the Global South Summit, which rose expectations of a lot of these countries which had been underrepresented or not represented at all at global forums. India became their voice. Now, as we are close on the heels of the G20 summit, what are the likely outcomes? How much have we progressed in terms of realizing this vision?
I think G20 has given India that platform and opportunity to voice its narrative. And I think it has done that very effectively in the last few months. The very fact that it chose the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as a theme for G20, which is really the inclusive world as a family, etc. And I think this has resonated very well with the people. For instance, the tagline of G20, which is one planet, one family, and one future, which Prime Minister has added or explained by saying that we need healing for the planet, we need harmony in the family, and we need to have an inclusive approach. So I think this has given us a very good platform to unfold several initiatives. And amongst the initiatives that we have today outlined, the digital initiative, for instance, the DPI initiative, which is now it's a signature initiative of India. Practically in every meeting with Global South, the Prime Minister, or even for that matter, even for major powers, Prime Minister is talking about digital public infrastructure, which is essentially how to bring inclusion using technology. Okay. That is one. The other, for instance, is one planet, one health, which is something which is going to be a big theme in G20. which also brings to the fore how particularly learnings from the COVID-19 and many initiatives have been unfolding. And similarly, the initiatives on disasters, disaster reduction, extreme weather events which we are now witnessing. Everybody is interested in how to deal with disasters. So disaster reduction initiative has been taken, and some meetings have been held under the G20 presidency very recently. So that's where India is also playing a role. And I finally also this whole issue of energy transition to clean and green energy. This is going to be an extremely difficult transition for everyone, whether it is major developing countries or developed countries. And I think India, by talking about International Solar Alliance or talking about green hydrogen and many other initiatives like that. So these initiatives are helping India to set up its position as a leader in the global south. Right. But of course, these have to be followed by implementation and by capacities and so on.
Absolutely. So the G20 is something that will continue to be in our focus for the next few months as well. But another important point that the External Affairs Minister touched upon in his speech in Parliament, Professor Pant, was the recent official state visit of the Prime Minister to the United States. The kind of relationship that India and United States have seen in the last few years, it's been an upsurge across diverse areas. But in terms of positive outcomes for India, if we talk about what have we gained, and where do you see the Prime Minister's visit on the trajectory of previous such visits that have taken place?
See, I think it has been a very important visit in many respects. And I think the biggest change that we are witnessing in Indo-US relationship is that the older problems and the problem perhaps that was somehow a constraint or being seen as a constraint is now becoming an opportunity. So this idea that, look, technology sharing is going to be a major problem. Technology sharing with the US has always been a big issue in the US. The US has always been reluctant to share that technology, to share critical technologies with India because of the past history. And there have been concerns in India as to how far America will go. What we are now seeing increasingly is the sense that both sides have realized that without moving forward in substantive way on this issue, the relationship will not be able to achieve its potential. And therefore, earlier this year, we are seeing step by step the two sides negotiating and putting in place a framework for high-end technology cooperation, for cooperation on critical and emerging technologies, that is called ISET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, and its impact on defense in particular. Because when you are talking of a strategic relationship for the future, you are talking of a relationship that can meet the requirements of 21st century. And for India, defense technology is going to be a big driver because India is also in the process of diversifying its partners. India is also in the process of at the same time building its defense manufacturing base. So, how do you use your partners to both get the kind of technologies that you want for operational reasons, as well as co-produce, co-develop with them so that your own defense manufacturing base gets strengthened. So both on the technology front broadly, on the defense side broadly, we have seen a unique convergence emerging that was quite visible, for example, during the visit of the Indian Prime Minister. Of course, apart from other aspects, economy and culture and education and space, we saw significant movement on two issues, defense and technology, where perhaps there was some ambivalence in the past. So I think this government's ability to change some of these challenges, to transform them into potential opportunities in this relationship has been a big, significant achievement. And I think Indo-US relationship, because of this way structural realities have changed, and because of the way India and US have engaged with each other, is going to be one of the most important relationships by definition for India and for the US also. So I think from US perspective also, when we see to India today, we look at India, which is shaping the Indo-Pacific regional security and economic architecture. And there is an interest in the US to cultivate India, to build a relationship with India, and to see how both sides can together, bilaterally as well as through mechanisms like Quad, manage the turbulence in the region. So I think all those factors, if you combine them, you saw the impact of that during Prime Minister's US visit, which was in the context of earlier visits, but perhaps will be remembered as one of the more significant visits that Indian Prime Ministers have had in the US.
Right. Dr. Gupta, so, not just the visit to the United States, his visit to Australia, his visit to France also, would it be correct to say that the Modi government has engaged in a very tactful deployment of soft power along with hard power? So while on one side we are diversifying our engagements with a lot of these countries, we're also globalizing Indian culture by the way of yoga, by the way of Ayurveda, etc. So it's a fine balance wherein we're also being assertive by an independent stance, but we're also utilizing or harping on the soft power.
Well, I think the hard power complements soft power, and India is using that very effectively. And there is a huge potential in future also to bring culture and our soft power to complement and enforce and strengthen our hard power. But there is no alternative to building the hard power. And as Harshpanji said, that defense, manufacturing, technology, I would add economic development. These are absolutely essential, and I think these visits have been aimed at strengthening our hard power as well as using our soft power. But I may add one more point here, which is that in the in this statement, a number of visits, etc., were highlighted. But one very important visit, which was also mentioned, which was the visit to Papua New Guinea, where the Prime Minister had the third summit of FIPIC with the Pacific Island nations. I think this is a very important initiative, which began sometimes in 2014, but now it is gaining momentum and speed, because in the context of Indo-Pacific, we should not neglect the Pacific. And in some of these Pacific islands, there are like for instance, Fiji, we have a significant population of Indian origin people. And we are seeing major developments in the Pacific Island nations where the Chinese influence is growing. So I think in Indian foreign policy now, there is a increasing recognition that those island countries also need to be approached. And India has that soft power. India has that capabilities in development partnerships, which is now beginning to deploy and enhance our influence there, enhance our engagements. And this will help us in dealing with what I think is the cardinal question of Indian foreign policy, how to deal with China.
Right. And as you speak about development partnership, let me quote here that the External Affairs Minister did mention in Parliament that India's development partnership portfolio spans across 78 countries. And the hallmark of these projects has been they are demand-driven. Most importantly, they are transparent, unlike the other countries. Professor Pant, another point that Dr. Gupta touched upon earlier, and which the External Affairs Minister spoke prominently about India's foreign policy, is that it is people-centric. How do you think that over the last few years, our foreign policy and our approach towards how we treat the Indians who are settled abroad, or the kind of engagement that we have with the Indian diaspora in terms of connecting them to the homeland, how has it affected the lives of common citizens?
You know, one of the most important things perhaps that this government has done is to convey to Indians that foreign and domestic policies actually, they converge. They are not. There is no such thing as that domestic and foreign anymore. What you have today are challenges. When you look at it from domestic developmental perspectives, they can only be met by India engaging more substantively abroad. And there are always, as you expand your footprint abroad, there are going to be challenges like the ones that you mentioned, where you'll have to take care of your own people, of your own interests, of your own assets, and that will therefore reflect on your capabilities at home. So I think it's a two-way street. And that perhaps has been the biggest achievement of this government in conveying this to Indian population, Indian people at home, as well as conveying it to Indians settled abroad. That you have our back if there are problems. Indian state will stand up with you. They will help you wherever you are. And at the same time, conveying to Indians at home that we have to be now confident enough of taking greater responsibilities abroad. That simply saying that, look, this is why are we spending so much money abroad? Why are we doing this abroad when there are so many problems at home? Those arguments do not cut much ice. And you see a lot of traction today in the Indian population, domestically, that you see that the divide, that the debate that used to happen, that, what is foreign policy? Why, what is this global engagement? Why, for example, Prime Minister or Foreign Minister is traveling so much? I think those questions have died down. You would recall initially, there used to be these questions. Today, no one is asking those questions. In fact, if at all, people are enthused by by the fact that Prime Minister is so active, Foreign Minister is so active, and other ministers are so active on the global stage, that India is so active on the global stage. So I think that has been a big achievement, and that has also shaped, for example, our presidency of the G20. When you see G20 events happening across India, you have Jan Bhagidari, people's participation at every level. G20 could have been a very elite-driven program and process. But I think this government converted into something bigger, made it reach out to various parts of this country, made India an exemplar in conducting global diplomacy, and also opened the doors of India for the rest of the world to come, to visit, to see India's developments, and then to become part and partners in the developmental partnership that India is making. And I think on both counts, we have seen great success in conveying that message, as well as in India being able to deliver increasingly when you have problems abroad. How do you help Indians settle abroad? Very difficult times, like, for example, Ukraine crisis, when the Ukraine war was happening, India was able to engage with multiple stakeholders and bring Indian students back. A great, again, example of India's engagement and consistent engagement with all stakeholders that allowed that made it possible for India to deliver those outcomes. So I think that question of foreign and domestic and division between the two, that is becoming redundant increasingly, and people are realizing that, partly because I think the government has been effective in its strategy and its outreach.
Dr. Gupta, perhaps it is this that has, taken India's global stature to unprecedented heights that we're discussing today. By virtue of size, by virtue of our population, by virtue of the kind of growth that India is seeing, we are a contender, and rightly so, to have a permanent seat at the UNSC. But now, looking at all these successes also, does it amplify our validity to become a contender at the UNSC at the earliest?
Well, India has been a contender at the UNSC for a long time, and I think there are very strong reasons why India should be there. And I think most countries in the world, they do accept that. And but getting a seat at the UN Security Council also is a process. And that process is extremely complicated, and it is victim to the geopolitical tensions that we have. Because you have to have some kind of agreement amongst the P5 for India's place in the UNSC. And that, unfortunately, is not going to happen anytime soon because of China. So while we can justifiably claim a place in the UN Security Council, but it will have to go through a process. And one of the early steps that need to be taken is that there should be the start of text-based negotiations at the UNGA. And there is a whole lot of things to be done in that direction. So I think UN Security Council seat is not there for us in the immediate future. But that doesn't stop us from playing our role, which we are doing through various other means, and G20 is one of those examples.
You're right. And as the External Affairs Minister rightly says, the world recognizes that when India speaks, it speaks not just for itself, it speaks for others. And we are following that policy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. That's something that has been our vision for G20, which is inclusive. We are taking along every country that has been underrepresented so far at all of these global fora. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Time allows me to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you once again, Professor Pant, Dr. Gupta, for joining us on the show today, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.